Hi, good evening, everybody. Shavua Tov, a wonderful new week to all. It's really a joy, a privilege, and an honor to be participating in this Global Day of Jewish Learning, and I thank you all for tuning in and look forward to spending the next hour thinking about the question of innovation and tradition with you, and especially the question of how we can be creative within the space that our tradition provides in terms of thinking about how to move forward and continue to adapt to changing new realities and also preserving and treasuring that which our tradition has given us. I want to introduce my guests this evening and thank them for participating. We'll be doing a participatory learning, and we encourage you to also follow along with the text that's on the site of the Global Day 24 by 24, and to also feel free to tweet your questions or comments to @theGlobalDay. So let me just give a minute for my guests to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'll start. My name is Josh Miller. I'm logged in from my home in Berkeley, California. My day job, I work at the Jim Joseph Foundation in San Francisco, where I have the pleasure of learning once a month with Maya during the daytime hours, but it's fun to do it virtually online with you all this evening.
Thanks, Josh.
Hi, I'm Esther Kostanowitz, calling in from Los Angeles, California, where it is not sunny because it is nighttime, but otherwise most of the time it is. I work part-time at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles, and I'm also a regular consultant for the ROI community, in addition to many other Jewish nonprofit organizations of a bricks and mortar or innovation perspective. I work with a lot of mainstream organizations as well as independent programs. So very excited to be here to talk about this topic, which is clearly a passion of mine as well, and to be with all of you.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, so I wanted to start with the story. I actually heard this story from Tully Skeist, who is a fellow as part of KEVA, which is one of the organizations that Upstart, which is the organization that I work for, which supports innovation in the Jewish community. KEVA is one of the projects that we've helped incubate. And here's the story. It's about the son of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. Ishbitzer Rebbe wrote the Mei Shiloach. He was a Hasidic master. And his son, Rebbe Yaakov Lehner, became in charge of the Hasidic Ishbitz dynasty after his father passed away. And slowly but surely, Rabbi Yaakov Lehner began to do things slightly differently from his father. So the Hasidim noticed that he wore his talit slightly differently from his father. And, you know, they didn't really say anything to each other because they thought, okay, maybe that's not such a big deal. And then they noticed he was starting to change some of the tunes. So he sang Lechadodi, the tune welcoming the Sabbath queen, slightly differently from his father. And this time the Hasidim started mumbling to each other, but again, they didn't want to say anything to the rabbi. Maybe it's not such a big deal. And every day and every week, he'd make these minor changes, and it got to the point where the Hasidim held a meeting, and they said, you know, we have to talk to the rabbi. This is unacceptable. He's making all these changes. It's radically different from how his father led the community. And so they picked a poor, trembling Hasid to approach the rabbi and to stand up to the rabbi. So the Hasid comes before Rabbi Yaakov Lehner and says, with all due respect, Rabbi, I am so sorry. I don't mean to insult you in any way, but the community is very disturbed. How is it that you're deviating from your father's tradition? How is it that you're doing things so differently from your father? And the rabbi laughed and he said, what do you mean? I'm exactly like my father. My father did things his way, and I do things my way. And I think that this story sort of captures that tension, right, of how do we simultaneously allow ourselves to grow and change and also preserve what is precious to us. And in the entrepreneurship sector, right, we're always looking for case studies to try and understand how various companies have remained successful over time. So people look at Apple, people look at HP. I actually think we can look at Judaism as one of the core positive, pivotal examples of how to simultaneously hold on to the structures and the culture, core products, if you will, and also be able to grow. And that's what I want to explore tonight. There are three things I want to explore, three broad categories. One is when we talk about tradition and innovation, what are we actually talking about? I want to spend a little bit of time trying to define those terms. The second is, what are the values behind them? What's valuable about each? What's valuable about growing and changing and innovating and adapting? And what's valuable about tradition and maintaining traditions? And also, what's threatening about each? What's so threatening about the change and the growth, right? What were the Hasidim in that shul so afraid of? What was so threatening? And at the same time, what's threatening about not changing and not growing and adapting? And then finally, I want to try and explore a little bit what are some of the boundaries and consequences of being in the midst of grappling with these two realms, right? How creative can we be and still be part of this process? How elastic is the system? So those are the three broad categories. And so let's start with our first text, which comes from the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Horayot, and I'll read this in the English. Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Gamliel, and the rabbis differed with regard to the following. According to one, the maintainer of Sinai is better. Sinai adif in the Hebrew. Sinai is better. The other said that Oker Harim, the uprooter of mountains, is better. And then they take this theoretical concept and they actually talk about people. Rabbi Yosef was Sinai, he represented Sinai, and Rabbah was Oker Harim, he was the uprooter of mountains. So the question was sent to the West, and the answer was Sinai is better since everyone is in need of the owner of stored up wheat. Even so, Rabbi Yosef, remember Rabbi Yosef who was Sinai, did not accept the position of the head of the college for 22 years until Rabbah, who was the uprooter of mountains, died. During all this time, Rabbi Yosef did not invite a bloodletter to his house. Right? That's the equivalent at the time of sort of the doctor or the physician. Okay, so let's try and understand what this text is talking about. There are these two categories. There's Sinai, right, which refers to Har Sinai, the mountain of Sinai, where the Torah was given, and that's used as a metaphor for one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is someone who's uprooting mountains. So, Josh, Esther, let's try and just wordstorm a little. If you had to try and unpack what you think the word Sinai is representing, let's just come up with some words for what Sinai might mean.
Tradition. Authentic tradition.
Well, I think for me it's Torah tradition, kind of the way things were. Mountains tend to be pretty standardly placed and rooted until somebody comes along to uproot them. In one of the midrashim about Mount Sinai is that Hashem, God, picked up the mountain and held it over the Jewish people to try to force them to accept it. So that is one of the images that came up for me, which is very interesting in considering what an uprooter of mountains might be, and what that connection is to innovation. I know that's kind of a long answer to your question about word brainstorming, but that's just kind of what came up for me.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Esther, that actually the Midrash that talks about how God held the mountain of Sinai over the people before they were accepting the Torah, in some ways perhaps you could argue either way. Does God represent Sinai in that moment, or is God literally uprooting Sinai in that moment? Really interesting question. And I see we're joined by Serena Eisenberg, Rabbi Serena Eisenberg, who's executive director of the Stanford Hillel. Serena, we're so happy to have you. Welcome. So on the one hand, right, Sinai represents tradition, it represents order, it represents stability. Rashi, the famous 11th century commentator, talks about what Sinai is, and he says Sinai is somebody who's learned Mishnah and Braita as it has been passed down from Har Sinai, from the mountain of Sinai. So according to that view, Sinai represents the tradition and it represents the knowledge and the fluency of knowledge that we imply when we talk about the tradition. Okay, so let's now wordstorm a little bit around uprooter of mountains, around Oker Harim. What does that bring to mind?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think the metaphor Esther kind of laid out carries really nicely. The one word that jumped in mind that she didn't use for me was enduring. And it's just interesting, right, that the metaphor here is a mountain, right? Tradition is the mountain, which we pretty much take for granted the fact that mountains stay where they are, and if they are going to change, it takes a very, very long time. And yet, the contrast to the person who maintains the mountain is the person who just can come along and uproot one, which to me seems like a very dramatic, disruptive thing that a person would be able to do. And yet, it's the juxtaposition and maintainer of Sinai. It's not like the person who chips away a little bit at Sinai. It's like the person who uproots it entirely. So
Yeah.
to me, it's like there's a real judgment there, right? Rabbi Joseph doesn't just tweak a thing here and there, like in the story you introduced at the beginning. He turns the whole thing upside down.
Right, Rabbah, right? Rabbah, who's the Oker Harim. He's turning things upside down.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's something very disruptive. Good, and radical, maybe, is another word we could think about for Oker Harim. And again, Rashi says, he uses the words charif umipulpal. Charif literally means spicy. In modern Hebrew, it's used for spicy, but this sense of somebody who's very feisty with the tradition, who's taking it and mipulpal, doing creative things with it. But Torah, right? Afal pi, Rashi says, even though Mishnah ubraita ein sdurin lo kolkach, even though he doesn't have as much knowledge of the Mishnah and the Braita. And part of what's interesting is thinking about if this is a spectrum, right? And on the one hand, we have the absolutely stable mountain, and on the other hand, we have this mountain that's being radically uprooted, disrupted, messed with, pushed over its side. There is a spectrum in the middle, and it seems, I think, that in the rabbinic tradition, they're pretty clear that the person who is uprooting the mountain, he has a certain amount of knowledge. There's a certain amount of fluency in the tradition, right? So it's not that he's totally unaware of where the tradition is coming from, and that the person who's knowledgeable has some level of creativity, and that's what's led that person to be knowledgeable. But again, I think it's a spectrum, and the question is, can the two even be separated one from the other? And I'm going to want to move on from this text, but one of the things that's very interesting is thinking about if, and Esther, we're going to get to you in a second. I see you want to jump in. So 1 second, and then we'll come to you. If they agree that Sinai is better, right? They seem to be making this blanket statement, we value the side of tradition and knowledge, and that's our core value, and yet they place the other guy as the head of the yeshiva, right? So they seem to be saying one thing with their words and then doing something very different with their actions. I think there are at least two ways to interpret that. One, that they're saying that we value both, right? If on the one hand we claim to be valuing the tradition and the knowledge, and we're saying that that's the most valuable, and yet we're placing the person who is the most disruptive as the head of the yeshiva, and the other person, is so humbled by it that he doesn't even invite the doctor to his house, which is a sign of honor, but he goes out to see the doctor, or according to other opinions, he's rewarded for not having the honor of being the head of the yeshiva, and he doesn't even need a doctor during those years, that somehow he's rewarded for allowing Rabbah to be the head of the yeshiva. It's clear from this text that the rabbis are conflicted about which is better. And you might also think that by putting the guy who's the most radical as the head of the system, that's actually a strategic move. Because if the person who's the most disruptive and radical is encompassed within the system and is responsible for protecting and preserving that system, which you could argue the headship, right, the authority role in any system is responsible for protecting that system, that they're also saying we need the creative disruptors, but we need them to stay within our boundaries. If we put the guys who are the most traditional in the positions of authority, then the people who are most radical might end up threatening the tradition completely. And yet if we have somebody who's radical and disruptive, who's the authority figure in the system, then somehow we're preserving the ultimate health of the system by allowing for that system to have some creativity within it. Esther, sorry to make you wait.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure how to do the whole hand raising thing in Google Chat, but I just want to one more kind of like language note, because that's kind of where I come at texts from generally. So the idea of uprooting the mountain is not necessarily clear to me that that it is it's not necessarily always to disrupt or to throw out tradition, but it seems to also indicate some sort of portability. So to kind of take the mountain with you, as opposed to like leaving it where it is. So it's actually in some ways can be read as a very traditionalist perspective, except instead of leaving it where it is, you're taking it as it is and bringing it with you to wherever it is you're going to, whatever your destination.
That's beautiful.
That's kind of one of the things that's looping in my brain right now.
That's beautiful. I love that idea. I love that idea. In some ways, that's the idea of the Mishkan, right? Being able to take the stable and put it on your back and move with it, make it adaptable. So good. So this discussion is getting at sort of that first category of what I wanted to bring up. And again, we can spend more time on each of these. I'm going to move us on to the next text. But that idea that even when we think about what tradition means versus what innovation means, and I wanted to introduce these terms as sort of our standard metaphors for the evening, the Sinai and the uprooter, the Oker Harim, the uprooter of mountains, that it's not so clear that one is tradition and knowledge and the other is disruption and radical change, right? That, even from this quick discussion and some of your insights, there's this sense that perhaps the purpose of Oker Harim, of uprooting the mountain, is actually in order to maintain it in a deeper way and to allow it to come with us. And so this idea that there are two sides that are in opposition actually also might not be true. And maybe it's more that they're actually more deeply intertwined. I think about the left brain and the right brain, right? Maybe the Sinai is the left brain, which is more logical and linear, and the Oker Harim, the uprooters, the more creative, wild side. But you can't have a left brain without a right brain, or a right brain without a left brain. That the two need to really be working together, and that the wisdom is coming from how the two are interacting. Okay, so let's move on to the next text.
Can I just add a closing thought on that, Maya?
Yeah.
I'm sitting here wondering to myself whether Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Shimon, the guys who are setting up these definitions, when they think of sort of a Jewish radical, what they think of, because I think they think of something less radical than I think of sitting here in Berkeley, California. But I don't know what the outer bounds are in their minds.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a great question, and that's, I'm not going to address it for how the rabbis of the Talmud perceived it, but I think it's a good question. But I think that's a challenge for us, and that's part of where we'll get to a little bit later, is what are the boundaries, who gets to determine those boundaries? Those are big questions. Okay, so does anybody want, Josh, Serena, or Esther, do you want to read our second source, which also comes from the Talmud, from Masechet Temura?
I'm happy to.
Thank you.
So Rabbi Yehuda, son of Nachmani, the Meturgaman, the translator of Reish Lakish, offered the following exposition, the following drash. Write for yourself these words, for according to Ki Alpi, these words I have sealed a covenant with you and with Israel. That's Exodus 34:27. One part of the verse states, write for yourself these words. But the second part of the verse states, for according to Ki Alpi, these words. This teaches that you are not permitted to write down words that are oral teachings, and that you are not permitted to recite orally words that are written teachings. Let me keep going.
Okay, so let's pause there for a second, and thank you. This is actually a complicated text, but they're playing with two verses, or with the verse from Exodus. Write for yourself these words, for according to these words. And in that very beginning of the verse, there's the verb to write, that we're supposed to write down the words God is teaching us. And then ki al pi, and pi refers to peh, which is mouth. So it's this tension of writing things down and also speaking things. And the rabbis are trying to figure out, there are two, right? And according to the rabbinic tradition, there's the written Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses, and then there's the oral tradition, which we now have as a written tradition, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and everything that follows. But at the time these rabbis were writing, there was much more of an oral tradition. And they were connecting tension between the oral and the written tradition back to this verse from Exodus, implying that there are certain words that should be written down and certain that should be spoken, and never the twain shall meet, right? And they're saying because of this verse, you are not permitted to write down things that are oral teachings, and you are not permitted to essentially make what is written and treat it like oral, right? Like something that is spoken. So let's try and understand for a minute why. Why shouldn't we take things that are primarily an oral tradition and turn them into a written tradition? And why shouldn't we take things that have the weight of a written tradition and treat it as we would treat an oral tradition? Why keep the divide? Why is this divide important?
Well, I mean, you know, tying into the theme of the evening, it would seem to me that the written tradition, you know, by the fact that it's in writing and it's fixed in writing, means that we have something that we have to reckon with, you know, through the ages. We're not allowed to change, you know, the stories in the Torah. We can reinterpret them, but we're not allowed to change the core stories. Meanwhile, the oral tradition, our interpretations of those stories in our contemporary laws, if you write those down, you run the risk of fixing those, but in fact, those are supposed to evolve over time. So,
yes.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts about why they wouldn't want us to write down that which is oral or treat as oral that which is written? Okay.
I'll just, in addition to what Josh said, I think it creates this this kind of divide between sacred and potentially less than sacred, and it kind of creates a like a hierarchy of what is considered to be more weighty and more weighty and perhaps more sustainable versus something that may be flighty or uttered in a moment of passion, anger, or disrespect. There is so much biblical and Talmudic literature devoted to speech and what it does, even without intending to subvert it. So I think that the idea of something that's written, that you can interpret it. There is this Meturgamon, this translator who's here in the text and was very important to helping Jews access texts that they may not have had access to before. But there is also this really substantial tradition of being very careful about what you say and to whom you say it. Even if your intention is good, it may be subverted into something that is not good and that is disruptive in a harmful sense. So yeah, that's where I see words and oral teachings and things like that, and I think about that introducing of the human factor if indeed the text that we're talking about is assumed to have been divinely written versus divinely inspired, which is probably another Google chat. But I think that the idea of being careful about speech is one of the things that is coming out here. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that essentially what we're seeing is that there is, again, this conflicting and dual value of the value of the written, and that is symbolizing the Sinai. That's what needs to be preserved and treasured and passed down in a certain state, and that there's the value for the flexibility of the oral tradition, right? That's perhaps the Oker Harim, the uprooter of mountains. But if you lose one or the other, or if the oral tradition then becomes as definitive as the written tradition, then you're in some ways desecrating both, right? And you're preventing us from the kind of growth that we need, because you're saying that which should be flexible becomes stable and written in stone, and then you're also potentially getting rid of what is really valuable by saying that which is written down we can mess with and play with. But let's look at what happens at the end of
this text. Josh, do you want to finish reading this for us?
You know, I want to bring two other voices into the conversation before we move there. One is from Serena, who I can see but is having microphone trouble, who commented that she's trying to imagine the context of when this was taught and how much more more precious and rare was the written word, with far less written material and literacy versus today. And as she types this, and the immense quantity of virtual written material. So I think that's a really interesting point. And you know, we got a question too. Maybe you want me to ask it at the end, Maya, or you wanna keep rolling?
I think we can keep rolling because I want to make sure
we'll hold off on the question from the accidental Talmudist for another minute here. It was said in response to this teaching, perhaps a new teaching is different. For Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish would pursue the book of Agadah on the Sabbath, and they justify their action in the following manner. It is time to act for God, for they have violated your Torah. This is from Psalms 119. It is better for Torah to be uprooted than for Torah to be forgotten in Israel.
Okay, so again, we find that the ideal that they argue for, right, the ideal in the other text was Sinai, and yet they placed the uprooter of mountains as the head of the yeshiva. Here, the ideal is not writing down the oral tradition, and yet we see that rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, respected rabbis, are sitting and learning from a book of oral traditions that were written down. And how do they justify their action? It's better for Torah to be uprooted, and again, look at that word uprooting, right? It's the same as Oker Harim, uprooting the mountains. It's better for Torah to be uprooted than for Torah to be forgotten. And what I want to use this text to represent, and I want to keep going, is that one of the values behind innovation or change is that we have no choice. It's better for us to make the changes that are necessary in order to ultimately preserve the system as a whole. Right? And so I would argue that according to this text is a placeholder for the perspective that change should only happen. Innovations or disruptions or putting the mountains on our back should only happen if we have no other choice in the matter, and if we don't do that, then somehow everything we've built will deteriorate. That's one perspective. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the only reason to make any fixes or changes is if something is breaking to such an extent that we have no choice but to hold it together. I think that's one perspective that this text is bringing. We have a very different perspective in source number 3, and that's a source from Amos Oz, and he's a contemporary Israeli author, so we're jumping to a very, very different temporal perspective and philosophical perspective from the Talmud to Amos Oz. And this is a quote from him speaking to the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, Haganat HaTeva. And he says, actually, Esther, do you want to read for us this text?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. And now it is time to reveal a terrible confession. I am opposed to the expression, the preservation of nature. The very idea of preservation is unacceptable to me in almost every aspect of life. I don't like the expressions preservation of tradition, preservation of Zionism. We did not come into this world to guard and preserve anything. I don't think that the relationship between people and location, or people and God, or between people and their heritage are relationships of preservation. We were not born into a museum, and our role is not to polish the glass and pull our children behind us as if on their tippy toes to be amazed at what is. It is permitted to touch. We are allowed to touch nature. We must touch it. We can even change it. The question is how to touch. In one word, I would say with love. However, the touch and change must be mutual, a two-way street. As you change those near you, or your environment, or your surroundings, be prepared to open up to being touched and being changed by them. As you form the world, allow the world to form you.
Thank you, Esther. So this is a powerful text, especially, I love that he's getting up in front of the Society for the Protection of the Preservation of Nature, and then he says, I'm against the preservation of nature, right? But this idea, I think, that he's representing, which is the literally opposite value that we saw in the text before, which is that change is necessary only if the system won't survive without that change. I think Oz is making the opposite point. No, we're here to touch. We're here to make a difference. The reason that we are here interacting with the Jewish tradition is so that we can take that Jewish tradition and make it meaningful to us living as we're living today. The question is how we do that. This text always reminds me of one of the first times I took my child to a museum. My husband and I were at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco with our then 3-year-old daughter, who was learning the Aleph Bet in her preschool. And the museum had an exhibit of Chagall artwork. And, you know, there's this big floor-to-ceiling painting that included some of the Aleph Bet letters. And there was no gate, there was nothing in front of the painting, meaning you could be in the museum room and actually go right up to the painting and touch it. Of course, we weren't doing that. We were sitting, looking at the painting together, and I said to my daughter, do you see an Aleph or do you see a Bet? And she got so excited because she identified the Aleph that she jumped out of her seat, ran over to the painting, and put her hand smack against the painting, the original painting, and touched the Aleph. The guards came running. You know, we were appropriately chastised. But so this text raises a really interesting question, right? On the one hand, we are not in a museum of Judaism, right? Our goal is not to ensure that nobody gets fingerprints on it. In some ways, Amos Oz is making an argument that we should get our fingerprints all over it. The question is, how do we ensure then that the painting stays authentic, that it stays true and vibrant? I think that question, his question of how to touch, is the real core question in his text. But the value of we're not in a museum, I think, is very powerful.
I'm gonna ask this question since I think it's timely here.
Okay, great.
It comes from somebody online who called themselves the Accidental Talmudist. The Aguna crisis is an area where change seems to be desperately needed. I asked a Haredi rabbi why the issue seems more difficult now than 200 years ago. He said that even in this world, men have less respect for their rabbis now than they used to, and hence they cannot be effectively compelled to give the get. Do you think the change in this area should come from halacha or something more related to attitude shifting through education and community building?
Josh, thanks for sharing the question. It's a great question. The Aguna crisis is a huge problem, and it's a big topic. To quote Esther, another Google Hangout at least it is necessary to devote to it. But I would say, to answer that, just the bottom of the question, should it come from halacha or through attitude shifting through education and community building, I would say yes and. Right? I think that halacha and halachic changes can only come in a context of a community undergoing deep thinking about these issues. I think, you know, I'm sort of not going to answer in terms of how halacha changes and shifts over time, but I think that we need both in order to make real change in our system, right? I think that's the Oker Harim and the Sinai. I think that if we only make the changes, you know, by saying this is unacceptable and we want to change the laws completely or disregard the laws because they're too complicated to change, then we're not going to ultimately make the changes that we need. But if we only focus on the halachic process, maybe that will go too slowly as it is going now in terms of making the changes that we need. So I think we need both, and I think that part of what I'm trying to do is, rather than speaking about specific issues, is talking in general about the context in which we look at this. The Aguna crisis might be an example of the text we saw from Tamura, where we're at a crisis point, and that's what's pushing us to make change. But you can also look at it from the Amos Oz perspective, which is that as a society, the way in which men and women relate to each other, the way in which we enter into relationships has radically shifted, and it's our responsibility to ensure that as Jews, the terms of our relationships are also growing and shifting, and that's part of our responsibility. Okay, so let's move on to the next text. And actually, before we do that, if the folks online are able to see that there's a little game that I also uploaded that I've shared on the site called the 30 Circles game. And I want to use it as a quick metaphor. It's a blank page with 30 circles. So if you're watching from home and you don't have it, you can just literally make a page with 30 blank circles quickly. And Josh, Serena, Esther, I'm not sure if you have it, but you can also just quickly doodle 30 circles on a page. And I'm going to ask you to spend about 30 seconds and to try and transform, great, Serena's got it, transform as many circles as you can in the next 30 seconds into other objects. So for example, a circle could become a baseball, or a smiley face, or a world. So no questions. Ready, set, go. Take 30 seconds and try and transform as many circles as you can into other objects.
Maya?
Yes.
This is just a little note for everybody watching at home. You can download the source sheet that Maya is referring to and also the 30 Circles worksheet right below her video on our page, theglobalday.com/24x24. Both of her documents are available for download there, and you can feel free to chime in with questions on Twitter anytime you want.
Thanks so much, Lily. Okay, guys, about 10 seconds left. Okay, and really I should have given you a minute, but that's okay. How many of you transformed all 30 circles? 15 circles? 10 circles? 9? Yes? Josh got 9 or 10? Serena's got 5? Okay, so did any of you...
Got like 9.
You got 9. Okay, awesome. That's great in 30 seconds. Did any of you combine any of the circles to create something, or did each of you use each individual circle?
I used 2 as a pair of eyes.
2 as a pair of eyes. Great.
I did. Is it eyeglasses?
Eyeglasses.
Eyeglasses.
Okay, great. Did anybody, so part of what I think the point of this game is, and the reason I wanted to introduce it here, is because there's this notion that constraints drive creativity. And where we're moving is, right, we've talked a little bit about what Sinai and Oker Harim represent, right, that they could be 2 opposite things in a spectrum. They could also be more closely related than we might think. We talked about some of the values behind why innovation is so critical, either because we have no choice, because otherwise we're at risk of losing everything, or because that's why we are here, right? We're here to be touchers. We're here to make a difference. We're here to affect the tradition and make it ours. The question is how. And so what we're now moving towards is that question of what are the boundaries? How do we make the kinds of changes we want in the system? And so the idea that in some ways this 30 circles game is a metaphor for how I think the Jewish tradition approaches making changes in a system. So on the one hand, you have the constraints in the game, right? You have 30 circles and you have to transform them. And creativity literature talks about how constraints, having very clear limitations, actually allows us to be more creative. So you could argue that the Sinai, the tradition, allows us to be Oker Harim. That we're only able to be uprooters of mountains because we have the Sinai, because we have the mountain. And yet, if we have too many constraints in our creativity, we're actually less creative. So in this game, right, if you wanted to, if the goal, if I told you to transform as many circles as you could in 30 seconds, in theory you could have made a big circle around all the 30 circles and called it a basket of circles. Or you could have, I once led this exercise and somebody colored in a tiny bit of each circle, more and more and more, until it sort of looked like phases of the moon. One of the circles in the middle was fully colored in, right? So he used all 30 circles. That often people assume, oh, I'm not allowed to make a house out of 10 circles and a car out of 15 circles and use all the circles together. That's cheating. But I actually never said that, right? So that tension between, yes, you have to be within the constraints of the game, and yet we also often will place constraints on ourselves that limit our creativity, that limit our abilities to play and mess with the system. And it, again, maybe those are some of the boundaries of what it means to be an innovator in our tradition, that we have to keep to certain rules, but maybe we're also being too strict with ourselves in terms of which rules we're imposing. So with that in mind, I want to go to the next text, Eliyahu Zuta, and I'll read through this quickly. This is from a collection of Midrashim. Once I was walking and a man approached me. He had written Torah learning, but not oral Torah learning. And he said, the written Torah was given to us at Mount Sinai, but the oral Torah was not given at Mount Sinai. And I said, my son, both were given from the mouth of the Lord, and what is the difference between them? Right, so again, the context is the written Torah versus the oral Torah, which we've seen earlier. Here is an analogy. There was once a king of flesh and blood who had 2 slaves whom he loved greatly. To each he gave an amount of wheat and a bundle of flax. The bright one of the 2, what did he do? He took the flax and wove it and made a cover, and took the wheat and made flour. He sifted the flour and ground it and kneaded it and baked it, and then placed the loaf on the table and spread over it the cover, and set them in place until the king came. The foolish one of the 2 did nothing at all. When the king came to his house, he said to them, my children, bring me what I gave you. One set out the loaf on the table and spread the cover over it, and the other brought out the wheat and the flax in a pile. Oy, what an embarrassment! Oy, what a shame! Which of them do you think was the more beloved? The one that brought out the loaf on the table. So how do you think this text is adding to that question of what are the boundaries in which we are allowed to be creative? Right, so it's a story about a king who gave these raw materials to 2 of his slaves, and one of them, presumably to protect those materials, kept them and didn't do anything with them and made sure that they were preserved in their pure natural form. The other one did something with them, but he did something very specific. He made it a cover, and he made bread. Right, and the king obviously preferred the one who did something.
Well, I think the shot reading, I studied this text with you before, and I remember we had an interesting discussion about it. But I think the shot reading, which is, I think carries with the theme here, is that the one, if you take something and make it better and make it more delicious and sort of more beautiful, that is what the king values, right? That we apply we mix what we can do with that which has been given to us, and it's better because of it. The issue I take here, which I think is what I raised the last time I looked at this with you, was how conventional was the choice of the son in what he made with what he was given. He didn't add chocolate chips to his challah or anything. It was pretty. It was sort of what you'd expect him to do. And I don't know. What do you do with that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Although you could say, perhaps, right, that this was the first time that bread was being made, or that a cloth was being sewn, and then he was very creative.
Right. We don't know that.
We don't know that.
Well, I think for me, what's coming out here is the question of which one of them is the more innovative. Beloved, I don't know, that's kind of not our topic here.
Right.
But in terms of which one is the more innovative, the question of, once you make something from raw materials, you can't unmake it. You can't unmake the bread into those raw materials. So in some ways, the raw materials represent potential. Maybe they could have been something else other than bread, but once it's bread, it's bread. It's already been baked. You can't unbake it. All those lovely metaphors. So the question of it's open-ended here about which one is more. It says the one that brought the loaf out on the table is more beloved because he transformed it into a product that you could use, or that's something that actually gave life and gave sustenance. But I think that there's an interesting way to look at it from the other perspective, is that the foolish one did nothing at all, but in some ways the foolish one also preserved the natural potential of those items. So that's my subversive kind of reading of this. Not necessarily he is deemed the foolish one, so I think it's very clear we're supposed to see him as somebody who's either lazy or somebody who didn't do what he was supposed to do with the raw materials. But I think that there is kind of a metaphor to be drawn out in terms of what happens sometimes in Jewish life is that we worry about keeping the things as they are and don't take the chance to bake it into something that would create greater sustenance. So I think that there's a trend sometimes toward this kind of preservational attitude that we heard about from the Amos Oz text. That we want to keep it as it is, but this non-fool person interacted the way Amos Oz was saying that we need to interact with the environment in order to keep it thriving. So there's some interesting tensions there for me.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, and I see Serena is asking a really important question here about whether or not I'm using the words creative and innovative interchangeably. She says, it seems to me we are commanded to be creative, right? Procreate, pruervu, or in offering a chidush in interpretations, or in this story, taking the blessings of the world that God has created and then perfecting it, which is an idea from Rabbi Soloveitchik. This is creativity for a particular and constrained divine purpose. Is innovative the same things? In what ways is it different? I think that's a very good question, Serena. I think of innovation often as leading to certain changes. I think that in the Jewish tradition, innovation is for what purpose? It's for that overall divine purpose. You know, again, we perhaps define that divine purpose differently, but the innovations are the changes that we make in order to keep this tradition vibrant and alive. Creativity is the process through which we come at those innovations. I think creativity is more about the ways in which we approach ideas and each other and the text and the tradition that then allows for innovations. But it's a good question. I have to think more about it. And you know, Esther, to your point about who's more innovative in this story, sorry. I think that maybe the text is calling the one who did nothing foolish, because the very purpose of what he was not doing was to preserve so that something great could be made, in theory, right? And yet there's something foolish about that because nothing is being made. And so if we are trying to protect so much what we treasure about this tradition, so that the tradition can speak to people, so that it can be preserved, so that it can be meaningful, and yet we are not interacting with it, even though our interactions might then bring it to a place that doesn't allow it to go back to that original pure state, ironically, we are losing that which we are trying to preserve. And I think that that might be one of the ideas here in this story. And that, again, you know, back to that metaphor of the 30 circles, right, what constraints are we putting on ourselves? And maybe, Josh, that's to your point, that the one in this story who was doing something, who, Serena, either was being creative or leading us towards an innovation, which is being in relationship with bread and challah cover rather than being in relationship with, you know, wheat and flax, which is a different system. Maybe he wasn't adding chocolate chips because he was placing that constraint on himself, again, metaphorically speaking. But maybe he wasn't adding chocolate chips because chocolate chips was beyond the pale of the system. But somehow the system, the creativity allowed in this system doesn't allow for the level of innovation of chocolate chip challah. It's somehow that's beyond the system. And I think that's the core question when we think about innovation in Jewish tradition. The core question is, what are the constraints? What are the hows, right? Of how much and who determines how we're allowed to be creative, and how much and who determines what the ultimate structure is. And if we have that ultimate goal of preservation, like in that early Talmud text we saw about it's better for Torah to be uprooted than for it to be lost, what's the minimum we need to do, right, in order to preserve it? But if we have the attitude of Amos Oz, which is we're supposed to touch it and make a difference, what's the minimum that needs to be preserved as we are creative? So I want to end with three last thoughts from three very different texts. The first is from Tina Fey, one of my favorite comedians, in her book Boston. Rav Fey, yes. And she says, the first rule of improvisation, she's talking about improvisational theater. She says the first rule of improvisation is agree. Always agree and say yes. So if we are improvising and I say, freeze, I have a gun, and you say, that's not a gun, it's your finger. You're pointing your finger at me. Our improvised scene has ground to a halt. The second rule of improvisation is not only to say yes, but yes and. You are supposed to agree and then add something of your own. If I start a scene with, I can't believe it's so hot in here, and you just say, yeah, we're kind of at a standstill. But if I say, I can't believe it's so hot in here, and you say, I told you we shouldn't have crawled into this dog's mouth, now we're getting somewhere.
True that.
And I think that, again, to sort of leave us probably with more questions than answers, but to leave us with some final metaphors, that metaphor of yes and, I think, is part of what, when we think about the question of how we can be creative with our Judaism, how we can innovate in Jewish tradition, we should adopt an attitude of yes and, which means we're not saying no to that which has come before us. Our goal is not to create such radical disruptions or shifts that we leave behind what has been so precious, and which is the mountain on which we're standing and trying to uproot, right? That somehow we have a yes, this mountain is valuable to us, and I want to figure out how we can put it on our backs so that it's more portable, right? Yes, the oral tradition and the written tradition each symbolize something different, and if we don't write down the oral tradition, we're going to lose it. So how might we write it down and maintain an attitude towards it that it can be flexible and adaptable, right? That somehow we need the yes and we need the and. Another idea comes from a theory called adaptive leadership, which is in source number 6. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the idea there is that anytime we make a change, anytime we grow or adapt, we are often letting something go. The metaphor is for adaptation in a plant. If a flower or a plant is in an adaptation process, in order for it to survive, it often has to let go of at least 5% of its DNA. And you might say, well, 5% isn't very much, but we as human beings share 95% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So that 5% of our DNA is literally what makes us human, right? So that 5%, even if it seems like a small number, is actually tremendously valuable. And if we think about what is it that when we make these changes, again, whether we're coming from the attitude of we're making these changes because we have no choice, because we'll literally die, or this tradition will die if we don't make the changes, or because we believe it's our responsibility, we're commanded to be creative, to make these changes, regardless, I think we have to acknowledge what is lost in the process. And something, when we make changes, when we are uprooters of mountains, we're uprooting something, and something is harmed and lost. And I think that part of why it's difficult often for us to make changes as a community, regardless of the religious perspectives or denominational perspectives we're coming from, I think from any perspective, it's because we're not fully giving time to what's lost. And we're not acknowledging it, and we're not facing it and owning it, because part of what we need to do in order to put that mountain on our back is talk about, well, what are we losing by the fact that the mountain isn't in the same place anymore? Any thoughts? Any thoughts about that before I wrap up with our final text?
I was just thinking from the circle activity.
Well, I'll say something about Reb Faye's text.
Okay, great. So Esther, and then Josh will come back to you.
Okay. So in reading Reb Faye's text, and I do enjoy her texts very much, both written and oral. I have to say that I use this metaphor a lot, just in terms of not just the concept of the yes and, but the yes and as important in terms of building teams that work well together. When I talk about Jewish leadership, I often talk about two different styles of leadership. One of them that's more like stand-up comedy, where there's somebody who's like talking at an audience and like just kind of frontally shoving information at them, which then they can choose to either accept or reject, versus the teamwork of improv, where people are actively like it's a conversation. It's not stopping a conversation as soon as somebody says anything as a statement. It's about enhancing and building that statement. So I really do relate to that on a number of levels, both in terms of the conversation on leadership and in terms of a conversation about innovation and creativity. Because creativity, one person can be creative in a vacuum, but inevitably when you allow other opinions in and the Talmud knew this too, that when you allow other opinions in, that the entirety of the conversation is enriched as a result. So I just wanted to bring that in here to say that improv and the Talmud are the same, which is again another GChat entirely, which is kind of the sub hashtag for this whole thing, is that we have another GChat entirely on all of these concepts.
Okay, great. Josh, I think we're going to have to close, so I just want to end with a final text. This is from the Sfat Emet, the Alter Rebbe, from the topic of Simchat Torah. He says, "For each year the order of creation is renewed, and in truth, in each generation a new path is revealed through the Torah. And that is why it states in Deuteronomy, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kehilat Yaakov. The Torah was commanded to us through Moses, an inheritance for the community of Israel. It's an inheritance that is revealed in each generation and in every year." And the rabbis created a midrash about this verse, and they said, do not read morasha, which means inheritance, but instead read me'orasa, one who is betrothed. And they are saying that there are new paths in the Torah that have not gone from potential to actuality until the time and the generation emerge. And then, through the grappling with Torah, the paths will be revealed. And that is the characteristic of one who is betrothed, but not yet married. And that's the final metaphor I wanted to end with, the sense that the yes of the relationship we have with our tradition is a yes of betrothal, meaning we're in a committed relationship. We're not looking for another tradition. We're not looking for another set of texts. We are in a committed relationship, and yet the Tanaim, right, the terms of that relationship have not been signed and sealed. We can't sort of sit back and say, okay, this is done. We know how to do Shabbat. We know how to eat food. We know how to keep all these laws. This is all done, signed and sealed. We know how to treat women. We know how to treat converts, right? We don't have to worry about it. It's all signed and sealed. We get to lean back, relax, and enjoy the marriage forever. No, that those terms we have to keep coming back to them. We have to keep exploring them. We have to keep grappling with them. It's much more difficult, right? It would be easy if we weren't engaged at all, right? And we could then keep looking for the culture that worked best for us. Or it would be easier if we were engaged and married, and we could say, sorry, it's done. This is what our tradition says. We can't change it. I apologize for that. The Sfat Emet is telling us that we must exist in that space of tension where we're in that yes relationship with Judaism, but there's also an and. There's an and, which is we constantly have to sort of stay on our toes and figure out, when do we need the Sinai? When do we need to dig down and understand where our tradition is coming from and respect it? When do we need to challenge it? When do we need to start digging at that mountain to put it on our backs and walk with it? And that's what it means to be a Jew. And in some ways, maybe that's the philosophical underpinning of what has allowed Judaism to survive and thrive for all these years, is that we have never sat all the way on one side of the spectrum or the other. We haven't said Sinai is the answer. We haven't said uprooting Sinai is the answer. We've said we have to go hand in hand. It's the left brain and our right brain together. And I want to leave you all with a challenge to look at your personal lives and think, how am I on the Sinai side? And how am I on the Oker Harim side? How am I uprooting the Sinai? And then to challenge yourself, if you lean in one direction, to see what it feels like to lean a little bit in the other direction. And then to look at your communities and look at your organizations, your Jewish world around you, and to look at it and say, does it lean towards uprooting the mountain? Does it lean towards preserving the mountain? Why? What are the values behind it? And to push at it a little bit in the other direction from where it seems to be sitting comfortably. Because I believe that that's the music we make as Jews. That's our challenge. And I'm so grateful to Josh and Esther and Serena for being part of this conversation, to all of you who've listened in. And I wish you a good week. Shavua Tov.